Shlach lecha. We've heard from Jake and from Simon about sending spies into the land, seeing what is happening there, and whether you believe it or not, or have confidence in it or not, that the land of Israel is a place that you should shlach lecha, that you should send yourself to. Now, it didn't have to say lecha, it could just say shlach. But why is it that you should send yourself? You should send. It either is that an instruction that Moses should go send others to go, or maybe it's an instruction that you should go yourself to see what it is. But actually, we know what's there. In Exodus, God tells us that I will bring you up out of the land of affliction in Egypt, and you'll go to a land of milk and honey. So we don't need to send spies or scouts into the land to see what's there. Exodus told us what was going to be there. Or later in Deuteronomy, that it says that for the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land. So again, we don't need to go scout out the land. Other parts of the Torah already tell the Israelites what is going to be there. God told the Israelites what the land would be like. But Midrash Tanhuma, the 7th or 8th century collection of Midrashim, says that they needed to go see it themselves. The reports that God was giving and the promises that God was giving, the Midrash knows wasn't convincing enough. It wasn't necessarily because of a lack of faith in God, but there is something when you see it with your own eyes, that, the Midrash says, that is what was going to convince the Israelites of what the land would truly be like. And of course, we know, as was described, that there was great disbelief. 10 weren't sure that they could conquer it. 2 had the faith that they would thrive there. The Midrash also says that, well, why is this juxtaposed right next to the idea of the gossip of Miriam and Aaron that was just in last week's Parsha? Why are these two stories laid next to each other? Well, sort of as a warning about making wrong assumptions. Right? Aaron and Miriam made wrong assumptions and had a consequence. Maybe the 10 spies also had a consequence, which was that they had to wander longer. And so the Midrash says that these are laid next to each other as a sort of a warning. And again, see it with your own eyes before you believe all of the headlines. So shlach lecha anashim is how the Parsha begins. So to go forth and send people, and that's exactly what I did with 8 rabbis from the community this past week: Mickey Safra, Stuart Weinblatt, Aaron Alexander, Nisi Nantine, Shira Stutman, Chaim Schaffner, Ruth Friedman, and myself, led by Gil Prus, the CEO of the Jewish Federation. We left Monday night from Newark and landed Tuesday evening in Israel. We were in Israel Tuesday night, Wednesday, Thursday after dinner. We went back to the airport and I returned just yesterday afternoon. So 57 hours on the ground to shlach lecha, to see for ourselves, to bring solidarity and to understand what is happening in Israel. So let me tell you first why it was important for me to go, for myself, why it was important to go. Not only is Israel a core part of Bethel's identity, but it is part of my own identity as well. Israel is sort of a touchstone in my life. I've been there over a dozen times, and each time I'm at a different phase in my life. And so when I was 16, I went, and I was a 16-year-old. And then when I was 18, I had different experiences. And when I was 20, I had different experiences. And now I'm not 20 anymore. Beth and I were there when we were 20. But now at 51, when I go, and I have a different perspective. I see the wall the walls surrounding the ancient city of Jerusalem. And I say, no matter what trouble is happening in my life, these walls have witnessed worse. In my only 51 years, these walls have seen centuries. And so it's a touchstone in my life. It brings perspective on whatever it is, moments of joy in my life, and moments of hardship as well. It's a relationship with a place. It is to go to Israel for me. It is not about an issue. Israel is not an issue. Israel is a place that I'm interconnected with. And in a very small way, it might be interconnected with me. It's a safe place, even as there are wars. And for me, it grounds me, even as there are territorial disputes. So to go to Israel was something that I knew when the Federation was putting this trip together that I had to go. And so I appreciate the Chazan covering a few things for me last week, or this past week, on the schedule.
I got you.
I know, I appreciate that. So I want to focus on the internal struggle about what does it mean to be in solidarity with Israel, to stand with Israel. Because it is not a slogan. Well, it is a slogan, but it has to be far more than just a slogan. What does it mean to stand in solidarity with Israelis? It sounds very simple. And it sounds like a binary. You stand with Israel, or you don't. Or the inverse people frequently do, is you stand with Palestinians, or you don't. And that the conversation is so overly simplified, as if those are the only two things that are happening in the entire region. But actually what spoke to me was not that conflict, the 11 days of conflict with Hamas, not with Palestinians generally, but with Hamas in Gaza. And we stood on the Israel-Gaza border to learn more. And one of the things that I took away is really how interconnected Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, Israel, how they are interconnected in a way that doesn't show up in the headlines of the Times or the Post or wherever you get your news. That there are interconnections of economics between all of these groups. That's not going to be my focus of today's talk. But the question that I've been thinking about in the few hours that I've been back is that what is the responsibility, what are our responsibilities to all of Israel's citizens, and what is Israel's responsibility to all of its own citizens? When I say this, we have to remember that Israel has a citizenry of Jews and Muslims and Christians and Druze, because the thing that was different in these last 11 days of conflict wasn't what happened on the border in the south. That wasn't new. That has been planned for by both sides, and it is tragedy, and it is tragic. What was new was actually riots that took place in Lod and in other cities of Israeli citizen rioting against Israeli citizen. That is something that I've been trying to understand more. We met one night with Gadir Kamal Mare, who was the first woman Druze MK in Israel. She was actually also the first broadcast anchor, a non-Jewish Hebrew language broadcaster, anchor woman in Israel. And actually in August, she'll be here in Washington as one of the Shlichim team, as our shaliach here in Washington, D.C. So she'll be here for 3 years in the D.C. community. An amazing person. It's the first time the Jewish Agency has ever sent a non-Jewish Israeli out into the world as a shaliach or a shlicha in this case. And she'll be here in Washington. She is articulate and thoughtful about what does it mean to be part of this minority community of Israeli citizens, in her case a Druze. She speaks as a member of Knesset when she was part of the Blue and White Party and later Yesh Atid. She was eloquent about her feelings about the nation-state law and the implications of that, so many other areas, looking internally at Israel. But also this idea that it challenges the idea that Israel is both a Jewish country and a democratic country. And what are the responsibilities that come within that to minority citizens? It's a fascinating discussion. But in Lod, clearly the result was that those obligations had not been fully realized yet. Similar here in America, where we haven't fully realized all of our obligations as a country. In Israel, there's a number of mixed cities, they're called, where Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis live together. Akko and Haifa, Jaffa, Ramla, Lod, Bat Yam, maybe one or two others as well. But in Lod, there really was the actual rioting for days. The Garin Torani, the religious Zionists that live in Lod, are there and do both incredible work, are bringing social services, are really addressing the crime issues that take place in this really rough town of Lod, located kind of on the outskirts where the airport area is. And but are they doing good or are they doing bad? It's really a matter of perspective. So much of these internal struggles is a matter of perspective. So we met with the rabbi and a community leader of the Garin Torani, the Jewish community in Lod, and they described the work that they are doing and the fear that they had as these protests that turned into riots expanded. They felt threatened. The police were just absent from the city. And so from their perspective, they called in volunteers. From the Arab community perspective, they were settlers coming into Lod, and about 1,000 people came to either bring protection or from the Arab community to bring intimidation. I don't know. I don't know where the truth is in this. The truth is all of these things, that this is the experience. And when we sat with the imam and community leaders, I should add that Israeli Jewish cars were burned, a synagogue was burnt, a few apartments were ransacked. So the truth is there was real violence going on, and in both directions. Ultimately, an Israeli Arab and an Israeli Jew both died in these few days of riots. Hearing it from the imam and the community leaders' perspective, they actually were telling almost the exact same story, just pointing the finger in the opposite direction. Each side told stories of people spray painting the other's homes, marking them as a Jewish home, or as a Jewish home, or as an Arab home. Each side told the story of cars being burnt. It was an ugly scene. It was an ugly scene because, remember, what does it mean to support Israel? It doesn't mean just to support Israeli Jews. It means to support Israeli Arabs and Druze and Christians. It means to support Israeli citizens across the board. And that is a complexity that I think that we don't talk enough about. And so I stood there listening, I sat there listening, and I felt a conflict that I had not felt, or I hadn't felt it as clearly. Because for me, supporting Israel was so clear. It was actually against people that hated Israel, Hamas, and the state of Israel. And on that, there is no wavering, right? That I have spoken many times about loving Israel, having compassion for Palestinians, which is so central to what is going on, and to hate Hamas. And there are three distinct groups, but there are more than just three distinct groups. So sitting there and thinking to myself, I am here to bring support to Israel And here we have this conflict between Israelis, between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis. And they're both full citizens of the country. And so am I here to support them as well? It was easy for me to tell Penina, whose home was destroyed by a Hamas rocket, that we are here to support you. Those words came naturally and were clear. She was incredible the way that she described the miracle that she experienced, where she was in her kitchen, she felt a voice said, "Go into your son's room," and her son was sitting on his bed, and she went over to him and picked him up just as the rocket landed on their house. And she was able to save him. No one died in her home. In the home directly next door, the wall fell, and an Indian nurse who was taking care of the gentleman that lived there, the wall fell on the nurse, and she died. But standing at Penina's home, it was easy to say, I stand with you against those that hate Israel, that are actively trying to destroy the country and sent thousands of rockets. This was just the result of one rocket that landed. Imagine if all of them landed indiscriminately in neighborhoods. People have been talking about how it's proof of something that more Palestinians died in Gaza than Israelis died in Israel. That's not proof of anything. It's proof that the Iron Dome works, that their rockets were sent with the intention of landing and of killing and of maiming. Somehow, as if they had turned off the Iron Dome and the numbers of deaths were far greater but more equivalent, that somehow would bring a moral equivalency, doesn't make sense, actually. And there is tragedy in Gaza, and it's horrific. But to stand with Penina and to tell her that I support you and we care for you and that we 8 rabbis represent something like 8,000 families in the Washington, D.C. area, and that we embrace you. That was easy. But to be with other Israeli citizens in the school that we were sitting in Lod, and to tell that to the Israeli Arabs somehow, and I'm a bit ashamed about it, was difficult for me. This is not Hamas. These are not haters of the country. These are people that would prefer to have more services, better schools, things like that. Those are the complaints of citizens towards its government. And in the end, the more I was hearing what was happening, the division that was taking place within Israeli society, I realized I needed to be brave and to say similar words as I did to Penina. And to say that these riots in Lod are tearing the country apart, and we stand with you too towards a stronger country, towards a democratic country, towards a country that can provide these services to all of its citizens. Not just the ones that I learned about in 5th grade in religious school, not just the Israeli citizens that more feel like I feel, or look like me, or come from the similar background. But we use these words all the time about the diversity of the country and the beauty of the country and its minority citizens. And here were citizens that were asking for more. And as I do here, I stand with all Israeli citizens for making the country a better, stronger place. I stand in solidarity with those requests, those demands of the country. To love Israel means to love all of the Israelis. And to have compassion for Palestinians and to hate Hamas Those were words I said last Shabbos, and those were words I repeat this Shabbos with a new insight that means all Israeli citizens. But to think about what you might have done if you were sitting in that auditorium that we were sitting together. Can you appreciate that sense of conflict that I had, of being pushed beyond your comfort zone and to think deeper about what does Israel mean? Because to me, it means the exact same thing. To stand with Israel is without hesitation. But I think through this experience, I'm actually able to embrace that even more, because it means not just to embrace Israeli citizens like me. It means to embrace the diversity of Israel. Yet these are not enemies of the state, though they make demands of the state like every citizen does of a country. And they have real grievances that should be addressed. Better schools and garbage pickup and other things like Wi-Fi access, things like that. How Israel integrates its minority population, minority citizenry, is something that is vital. Not like the existential external threats, but this is an internal threat to what the nature of the country is going to be, to the long-term nature of it. And in Lod, it blew up. Israeli against Israeli. Sort of a canary in a coal mine. So I start with by standing with Israel. What it doesn't mean is to stand with Israel blindly, unthoughtfully, without critique. What it means to stand with Israel is to do so with knowledge, to stand proudly with Israel, to stand with all of the blemishes that Israel has as a country. I agree with what Numbers said. In this parsha, it says that the land we have traversed and scouted is an exceedingly good land. The Torah was right. The land of Israel that we have traversed, not just this week, but that all of us know and we have explored, it is an exceedingly good land. We don't deny the challenges, but we state that it is worth all of the difficulties that it takes to stand with Israel. The promises are true. It is a land flowing with potential, but only if we support all of Israel. By supporting Israel's Jews and Arabs and Druze and others, all the citizens of Israel, that is when Israel is going to be able to truly meet its fullest potential of incorporating all of its minorities. That's what it means to me to stand with Israel in the 57 hours I was there this week. Shabbat Shalom.